You want in? Then make yourself useful.
Rochelle pulled a mop from the hands of a passing staff member and held it out to me. Not to him. To me.
Wait.
The floor. Now.
I took it. Damon leaned against the wall and watched. He said something to the man next to him and they both laughed. I cleaned the floor. When I finished, I straightened up.
You missed a spot.
She tilted her wrist. The liquid spread slowly across the section I had just dried. Damon reached into his jacket and pulled out 2 bills. He didn't hand them to me. He let them fall onto the wet floor between my feet.
What's that? Your tip. Don't spend it all in one place.
He won't.
Look at him.
The man who dropped those bills had spent months telling investors that a $4.8 billion deal with my company was already sealed. He had used my company's name to fill this room, to raise capital, to make people believe a contract existed that he had never been offered. His wife had liquidated her savings and mortgaged a property on the strength of his word. Neither of them knew who they had just handed that mop to. What happens when the man they turned into a punchline is the only person alive who can sign or kill everything they have left? If you have ever been underestimated by someone who only measured you by what they could see on the surface, this one is for you. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next story. 12 years ago, Rochelle and I were just 2 people trying to hold on to an idea long enough to make it real. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, shared 1 car between us, and had a daughter who had just turned 4 years old. I was building a freight and transportation operation from scratch, 3 leased trucks, 2 contract drivers, and a distribution agreement with a regional food supplier that covered the monthly overhead most months and did not the others. I worked 6 days a week without complaint because I believed that the only way forward was through. I kept books at the kitchen table after Zaria went to sleep. Route maps, cost projections, the narrow margins that stood between staying open and shutting down. Rochelle sat across from me in those early years and asked questions about the business. She refilled my coffee without being asked. She told me she believed in what I was building, and for a while I think she meant it. But believing in something that shows no visible results across 2 years, then 3, then 5, is not a simple thing to sustain. What Rochelle saw, year after year, was a man who was always working and never arriving. No vacations, no restaurants that required reservations weeks in advance, no house in a neighborhood that announced us, no wardrobe that reflected the ambition she had signed on for. Just a man in the same rotation of plain shirts, driving a vehicle that was already 3 years old when we bought it, telling her that patience was the price of what they were building together. She stopped believing it was worth that price. I cannot name the exact moment it shifted. It was not one argument. It was the slow accumulation of 100 small moments where the distance between what she wanted our life to look like and what it actually looked like became impossible to paper over. One evening, she sat across from me at that same kitchen table and told me she wanted a divorce. She said it quietly, without raising her voice, the way you deliver something you have been rehearsing for a long time. I did not fight it. I understood her. I could not fault her for the limits of her patience when I had not given her much to go on. What I would not negotiate on was Zaria. Our daughter was 4 years old, and no version of this arrangement was going to reduce me to a visitor in her life. We worked out a custody agreement without turning it into a courtroom. I honored it every week for the next 12 years, every pickup, every school event, every track meet, every ordinary Tuesday she just wanted her father present for. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Booker Meridian landed its first major contract, a regional logistics agreement with a national grocery chain. $220 million over 4 years. I reinvested the majority of it. The second contract came 18 months later. The third came the year after that. The company grew past anything I had been able to fully imagine when I was calculating break-even margins at the kitchen table after bedtime. Over the following decade, Booker Meridian expanded into freight forwarding and warehousing, private port terminal operations on the Gulf Coast, rail infrastructure contracts with 3 different states, commercial real estate development, a national data center network, and eventually federal supply chain agreements that put the company in a category that very few private firms ever reach. I became a billionaire. I drove the same SUV I had owned for years, and I told only the people who needed to know. That decision, to keep my financial life separate from my life with Zaria, was not about false modesty. It was a specific kind of deliberate love. I had watched what money did to children who were raised inside it, the way it turned family gatherings into comparisons and made loyalty something that got bid on. I refused to do that to my daughter. I refused to let her spend her childhood calculating which parent's life was more enviable. So I kept showing up the way I always had. The same car, the same burger place on Saturdays, the same hoodie at her track meets where no one in the bleachers had any reason to think I was anything other than a working father who showed up consistently. That consistency was the only thing I was certain she would carry with her when she was grown. Because of it, Rochelle genuinely believed I had not amounted to much. She remarried 2 years after our divorce. His name was Damon Gaines. He ran a development firm called Gaines Urban Development, and he inhabited exactly the world Rochelle had always wanted access to. Custom suits for every occasion, a rotation of vehicles chosen to suit the audience, a private club membership, a circle of investors, bankers, and developers who showed up at his events and whose presence was itself a form of social currency. I was not an incompetent developer. I want to be accurate about that. He was capable at assembling deals and moving projects through financing and permitting stages. But he had built his entire identity around the performance of success, rather than the steady work of it. And that distinction mattered in ways he had not yet been tested on. Rochelle absorbed that worldview without reservation. She began making comments in front of Zaria that were clearly aimed at me. Things like, "It is important for you to see what a man looks like when he takes his future seriously." Or some people spend their whole lives saying tomorrow is the day, and then one morning they realize tomorrow already came and went. Over 12 years of pickups and drop-offs, I heard every variation of that sentiment. I never responded to any of it. I had learned a long time before that the most powerful position a person can occupy is the one that does not require announcing itself. There was one conversation I remembered more clearly than the others. Zaria was 13. I had come to pick her up for the weekend and she was still getting ready, so I waited on the front porch while Rochelle stood in the doorway behind me. She mentioned that Damon had just been featured in a local business magazine. She described the cover photograph, the write-up, the way the firm's name was becoming known in certain circles. Then she said, almost casually, that she wished Zaria had 2 parents she could be equally proud of when her friends asked what her father did for a living. I said nothing. I drove Zaria to get burgers, and we talked about her track times and whether she wanted a new pair of spikes for the season. That was the whole conversation. I was not performing patience. I simply understood something that Rochelle had not arrived at yet, that the loudest person in any room is almost never the most dangerous one. Damon had been pursuing a partnership with my company for nearly a year. Booker Meridian was developing a project called Meridian Gateway, a $4.8 billion infrastructure and mixed-use real estate initiative, and Gaines Urban Development had submitted a proposal to serve as the primary development partner. Damon had been communicating exclusively with my senior acquisitions team. He had never been directed to me personally because I kept my name off the external-facing materials on large deals. I had been doing that for years. It prevented exactly the kind of complications that arose when people discovered I was involved before I was ready for them to know. 3 weeks before Zaria's birthday, a complication arrived anyway. My compliance director received a formal complaint from a private investor. The investor alleged that representatives from Gaines Urban had told him the Meridian Gateway deal was already approved and that his capital commitment was backed by Booker Meridian's guarantee. Both of those statements were false. The deal had not been approved. It was still in active review. My company had issued no guarantee to any outside investor. What the complaint described was a pattern. Across multiple conversations with multiple investors over the previous 4 months, Damon's team had used the credibility of my company's name to attract outside capital for a partnership that had not yet been offered to them. The compliance review was still open when I drove to Crown Harbor Estate on the night of my daughter's birthday. Zaria had called me twice that week. The second time, her voice carried a particular kind of seriousness that 16-year-olds reserve for things that matter to them more than they want to let on. Dad, I know it's going to be a whole production over there. Mom's invited half the city, but I need you there when I blow out the candles. That's the one thing I'm asking you for. I told her I would be there. Crown Harbor Estate was a property I knew. A holding company under Booker Meridian had acquired it 4 years earlier during a portfolio expansion. It was the kind of venue that announced itself. Manicured grounds, valet parking, the sort of interior that made guests feel they had been granted access to something exclusive. The kind of place someone chose not for the occasion itself, but to make every person present feel the weight of being included. Rochelle had texted me that afternoon. Do not come in that old truck. And for once in your life, dress like you're somewhere that matters. I drove the same SUV I had owned for 6 years. Plain button-down shirt. No watch worth noting. No driver, no security detail, no advance call to the venue to announce my arrival. Damon was standing near the entrance when I walked up from the parking area. He noticed the SUV before he noticed me. Then he said something to the man beside him, and both of them laughed before he turned to address me directly. You making a delivery? I'm here for my daughter's birthday. He glanced back at my car. Hard to tell the difference. I kept moving toward the door. Rochelle was waiting just inside the threshold. There was a small puddle on the floor near the entrance. Water from a glass that had been knocked off a side table. A staff member had been moving toward it with a mop when Rochelle stepped in front of him, intercepted the mop without looking at him, and held it out toward me. You want in? Earn it. There were guests close enough to hear every word. Men in tailored suits, women in formal gowns, people who had come to this event as investors and clients and business contacts of Damon Gaines. None of them knew me. All of them were watching. Rochelle. The floor, Terrence. I considered every option available to me in that moment. There were more than she knew. The option that would have required the least effort on my part involved making one phone call. A call that would have lasted approximately 45 seconds and would have permanently altered every conversation being had inside that building. I could have made it standing right where I was. But through the glass doors behind Rochelle, I could see Zaria standing in the center of the room, scanning the entrance. She had spotted me. She could see exactly what was happening at the door, and she was watching her father stand there holding a mop. If I walked away, she would carry that image for the rest of her life. Not of her mother's behavior, of the moment her father chose something over his promise to her. I took the mop. While I worked, Damon walked a man over specifically to watch. I could hear him explaining the situation in a low voice, heard the laugh that followed. I kept my eyes on the floor and I kept moving. When I finished, I set the mop aside and straightened up. Rochelle lifted her champagne glass. She looked at me with the kind of calm that takes practice to manufacture, and then she rotated her wrist and let the champagne pour out slowly across the section of floor I had just dried. You missed a spot. Damon reached into his jacket pocket and removed 2 bills. He held them out over the wet floor, one in each hand, and released them. They floated down and landed in the puddle. There's your tip. Don't spend it all in one place. Laughter from the guests standing nearby. I looked at $40 soaking in champagne on the floor of a property that my company owned. Then I looked through the glass door and found my daughter's face. She had seen all of it. I picked up the mop and cleaned the floor a second time. Not because they had broken anything in me. Not because they had won. Because Zaria was watching. And the thing I needed her to take from this moment, the only thing, was the image of a man who knew exactly who he was without needing a single person in that room to confirm it for him. They let me in through the main entrance. I want to be precise about that detail because Rochelle had specified the service entrance, and I did not use it. I walked through the front door the same way every other guest had, and no one stopped me, because by then the moment outside had already served its purpose for her, and she had moved on to enjoying the party. The interior of Crown Harbor was arranged exactly as the venue allowed. A central reception hall with high ceilings, draped tables set along the walls, a bar on each end, and a raised platform near the far windows where a DJ had been set up. The decorations were elaborate and clearly expensive. Purple and gold throughout, Zaria's requested colors, though her preferences had been executed on a scale that transformed a birthday into something closer to a corporate gala. I counted the guests as I moved through the entrance hall. Somewhere between 150 and 200 people. I recognized approximately 4 of them as people who had any connection to my daughter's actual life. Rochelle intercepted me before I reached the main hall. She pointed to a small table positioned near the kitchen corridor. White linen, 2 chairs, set apart from the primary seating arrangement in a way that required no explanation. You can sit over there. I'm Zaria's father, and Damon paid for this party. I knew that last statement was not entirely accurate. Crown Harbor's event pricing ran through a hospitality management company that operated under a Booker Meridian subsidiary. Whatever Damon had paid for tonight's event had ultimately moved through an account that my company administered. But I had not come here to win an argument about billing. I found the table near the kitchen, set my jacket over the back of the chair, and waited. I had been sitting there for less than 3 minutes when I heard her. Dad. Zaria came across the room the way she always moved when she had been looking for something. Fast, direct, no wasted steps. She was wearing a deep purple dress she had picked out herself, and her hair was done in a way that I recognized from a photograph she had sent me 2 weeks earlier with the caption, "This is what I'm doing for my birthday, and I need you to tell me it looks good." I had told her it looked perfect, which it did then and did now. She had her arms around me before I fully stood up. "I've been looking for you for 20 minutes. "I know, I'm sorry." She pulled back and looked at my sleeve. There was a faint champagne stain on the left cuff where some of the liquid had caught me during the second round of cleaning. She touched it with 2 fingers. "What happened?" "Nothing, I'm here." She studied my face for a moment. She had always been able to read me more accurately than I was comfortable with. And then she let it go in the way teenagers let things go when they have decided the full story can wait. She sat down across from me and told me about the party, about which of her actual friends had come, about the DJ who had already played 2 songs she specifically asked him not to play. I listened. This was what I had come for. Rochelle had read my silence at the kitchen table as surrender. I understood that before it happened. She had always interpreted my stillness as weakness, the same way she had once interpreted the years of quiet building as stagnation. It was a consistent error in her reading of me, and I had never corrected it, because correcting it would have required me to change who I was, and I was not willing to do that. What happened next was a version of something she had done before, in smaller ways over the years, extending the demonstration past any reasonable stopping point. A staff member across the room was managing 3 different tasks simultaneously, and Rochelle had been watching him for a minute. Then she looked at me. "You're not doing anything." She lifted a tray from the nearby service station, 12 glasses of champagne arranged in rows, and held it out. "Take this to Damon's table." Zaria's expression shifted immediately. She started to say something. I looked at my daughter before I answered. She was watching me with the particular kind of distress that comes from being 16 and caring deeply about someone while being completely powerless to protect them from the moment they were standing in. Her hands had tightened around her glass. Her jaw was set. I needed her to see something specific in how I handled this. Not her father refusing and escalating the situation and drawing her into the middle of it. And not her father absorbing an insult with his head down as though he had no other choice. I needed her to see a man who understood exactly what was happening, had already decided how he felt about it, and was not altered by it in any direction that mattered. I took the tray. I looked at Zaria first, just for a second, calmly, in a way that I hoped communicated that I was choosing this, not enduring it. Then I walked out into the main reception hall. Damon was holding court in the center of the room near the bar. He had the posture of a man performing for an audience he had personally assembled. Shoulders back, glass in hand, weight distributed in a way that maximized the space he occupied. Around him were 6 or 7 men I did not recognize individually, but recognized collectively. The kind of investors who came to events like this because access to the right conversation was a more valuable commodity than any individual deal. I moved through the outer edge of the group and began distributing the glasses. Damon noticed me when I was 2 people away from him. He made eye contact, let a slow smile develop, and then turned back to his audience before I reached him. "Gentlemen," he said, "always remember to tip your servers." A ripple of laughter around the group. One man, standing to my left, actually reached into his pocket. I looked at him. He stopped, looked back at me, and seemed to register something that required him to look away first. I handed Damon his glass. I took it without acknowledgement and was already mid-sentence when I moved to step back. Which is exactly why, when Meridian Gateway closes Monday, the entire structure of development financing in this city changes. That's not a projection. That's a calendar entry. I stopped. A man across from Damon, silver cufflinks, careful posture, asked the question carefully. Has Booker Meridian formally approved the deal? Damon tilted his head as though the question was slightly beneath the conversation they had been having. We're past the approval stage. Call it a formality at this point. The signature is a scheduling matter. I set the tray on the edge of the bar beside me. The deal had not been approved. The deal was in active compliance review because his team had spent 4 months misrepresenting its status to exactly this category of audience. Private investors who moved money based on credibility and proximity to certainty. What Damon was doing right now, in this room, in front of me, was not a misstatement. It was a continuation of a documented pattern, performed live, with me standing 3 feet away. The silver cufflinks man pressed further. You've met with Booker directly? Damon made a dismissive gesture with his free hand. People at that level don't sit in on technical reviews. My team has handled every stage. This is done. A third man spoke. If it closes Monday, we're looking at Gaines Urban in a completely different tier. Damon raised his glass. Monday, gentlemen, we enter a different conversation entirely. I took out my phone. I typed 12 words to my general counsel and sent them, suspend gateway approval, full compliance review tonight. I have direct witness confirmation. I put the phone away and walked back through the room toward the kitchen corridor. No one called after me. No one in the group had paid enough attention to my presence to notice I had gone. The party continued. The DJ played another song Zaria had not requested. I found my table near the kitchen and I sat down and I waited. And I thought about the specific kind of arrogance it requires to use someone else's name as a guarantee when you have never met them. Not professional recklessness. Something more deliberate than that. Damon had been told my company's name. He had used it as collateral. The people in this room had made financial commitments based on his representation of a relationship that did not exist in the form he described. He had done it for months. He had done it again tonight. He had done it standing next to me. There is a version of power that announces itself constantly because it is afraid that silence will let the truth in. Damon had been performing all evening. Performing for the investors, performing for Rochelle, performing for me, performing for guests who had no idea what was actually at stake in every conversation he steered toward the gateway deal. Every gesture, every word, every carefully positioned introduction had been aimed at producing one outcome. A room full of people who believed in a story he had not earned the right to tell. I had watched it happen from 3 feet away with a tray of champagne in my hands, and I had said nothing. And he had not once looked at me long enough to consider whether my silence might mean something other than submission. I had now seen it with my own eyes, heard it with my own ears, and documented it in a message that my legal team would act on before midnight. The platform near the windows came to life a few minutes later. A microphone stand had been set up, and Rochelle walked to it with the ease of someone who had been planning this moment longer than tonight. She spoke about Zaria with genuine warmth for the first 2 minutes. And I give her that. She described our daughter's persistence and her kindness and her talent for making people feel seen. And all of it was true and earned. And for those 2 minutes, I felt the specific kind of grief that comes from watching someone be their best version of themselves while knowing it will not last. Then she pivoted. Zaria, you are surrounded tonight by people who show up. She glanced across the room toward Damon. By people who demonstrate what it looks like when a man takes his future seriously and refuses to apologize for his ambition. A pause that she let the room fill. That kind of example matters. Not every child gets it. The room responded. Applause from the section near Damon's table. I kept my face neutral and my hands flat on the table. Rochelle continued, there are men who spend a lifetime telling the people around them that tomorrow is the day, that the plan is almost ready, that patience is a virtue. She looked at my shirt. And then one day, tomorrow has already passed them by. Damon laughed. Lorraine, sitting 2 tables over, put her hands together. Zaria stood up. Mom, stop. The room quieted in the specific way rooms quiet when a teenager corrects a parent in public. I'm simply... You're trying to embarrass Dad at my birthday party. Zaria's voice was controlled, but only in the way of someone who has decided to be precise rather than loud. Stop. This was the moment Rochelle's evening had actually begun to go wrong, though she did not understand that yet. The scenario she had constructed required her daughter to remain neutral, or at least silent, required the audience to function as witnesses to her version of events. Zaria stepping in collapsed that structure entirely. Rochelle handled it the way people handle disruptions to plans they have been looking forward to. She redirected her frustration toward the nearest available target. What did you say to her? I had not moved. Nothing. She wouldn't react like this unless... She's watching what you're doing, Rochelle, that's all. Rochelle stepped off the platform. Her voice had dropped below the microphone range, but the room was quiet enough that the guests near us could still hear every word. You come in here dressed like that, sit there like a martyr, and somehow my daughter ends up thinking I'm the problem. Zaria is both of ours. Not tonight. Tonight, this is my event, in my house. You know that's not accurate. Get out. She said it without changing her volume. Then she turned to the security personnel stationed near the main entrance and raised 2 fingers. The 2 men began to move in my direction. Zaria stepped in front of me before they reached the table. Don't. Damon pulled the microphone from the stand and walked to the center of the room with it, as though he could reframe what was happening through proximity to the speaker system. Zaria, there's no reason to make a scene. This is still your birthday. Terrence just... I'm handling this, I said. Damon stepped closer. He lowered the microphone but kept it live, the way people keep a weapon visible without raising it. He spoke quietly enough that he believed only I could hear him. You should be grateful we even let you in to see her. The microphone was still on. Half the room heard it clearly enough. I have been still in difficult moments before. I have absorbed things that required considerable discipline to absorb. The mop, the champagne, the $40, the table by the kitchen, the tray of glasses and the invitation to tip the help. I held all of it because I had come here for my daughter, and because none of those things had the power to change what was true about me or about my relationship with her. That one sentence was different. It was different because it was not about me. It was about the premise that another man could determine what access a father was permitted to his own daughter. That Damon had the authority to frame my presence here as a concession he and Rochelle had chosen to make, rather than a right I had never required their permission to exercise. Zaria heard it. She turned toward Damon with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger exactly, but the particular look of a person who has just received a final piece of information they needed to make a decision. Dad, she said without looking away from Damon, don't go anywhere. I put my hand on her shoulder. I'm not going anywhere. I took out my phone. A new message from my general counsel. Legal team arriving. Compliance findings confirmed. Multiple violations documented. I read it once. Put the phone back in my pocket. All right, I said quietly. Now we deal with this. The 2 security personnel were still moving toward me when the door to the main hall opened from the corridor side. I recognized the man who came through it before he had fully crossed the threshold. Marcus Webb. He had been managing Crown Harbor's event operations for the past 2 years, and he ran a tight professional venue, the kind of operation I had specifically retained the property management company to maintain after the acquisition. He was composed under almost every circumstance I had seen him handle. How was not composed now? He came through the door at a pace that was not quite running but was clearly not walking either, and his eyes swept the room until they found me, at which point his face went through 3 distinct expressions in rapid succession: recognition, disbelief, and the specific horror of a man who has just understood what has been happening in a space he was responsible for. Mr. Booker. The room had already quieted from the microphone exchange. Marcus's entrance quieted it further. Rochelle turned around. Damon lowered the microphone completely for the first time. Marcus crossed to me directly. He did not stop to acknowledge anyone else in the room. Sir, I wasn't informed you'd be attending this evening. If we had known... You couldn't have known. I'm here as a parent. His eyes moved to the champagne stain on my cuff, then to the mop still leaning against the wall near the entrance where I had left it. He looked at Rochelle. He did not say anything to her, but his expression communicated more than a full sentence would have. Damon spoke from the center of the room. You know this man? Marcus turned slowly. Know him. He seemed to consider how to answer that. Booker Meridian owns Crown Harbor Estate, Mr. Gaines. The silence that followed was of the specific variety that descends on rooms when a structural assumption collapses. Not the silence of surprise, exactly. More the silence of recalibration, of people quietly revising the architecture of everything they had believed about the last several hours. Rochelle looked at the entrance hall she had spent the entire evening using as a stage. The vaulted ceiling she had gestured toward when she described the venue to guests. The marble floors she had watched me clean. I had not said a word about any of it. Damon recovered quickly. I will credit him that. Terrence. He said my name with the familiarity of a man who had decided we were now on the same side of something. Listen, tonight got a little out of hand. People said things. Which things? He stopped. The mop, I said, or the $40? He had no useful answer for either. From outside, 3 black SUVs pulled into the circular drive. I watched through the window as the doors opened. My general counsel, David Reeves, stepped out first. Behind him came the Director of Investment Compliance and the external legal coordinator who had been managing the Gateway documentation review. Damon recognized David Reeves the moment he walked through the door. Every senior person in real estate development in this city knew David Reeves on site. Damon had sent him 47 emails over the past 11 months. I knew this because David had shown me the thread 3 weeks ago when the compliance inquiry began. Damon stepped forward with his hand extended. David, I didn't realize you'd be... David walked past the extended hand without breaking stride and stopped in front of me. Mr. Booker. He handed me a bound folder. The Meridian Gateway header was visible on the cover tab. The room understood the gesture before I opened it. I turned to Damon. You told the people in this room tonight that the Meridian Gateway deal was approved. I said it was essentially... You said it was past the approval stage. You said the signature was a scheduling matter. I let that sit for a moment. Those were your exact words. A man to Damon's left. Silver cufflinks, careful posture. The same man who had pressed him on the question earlier spoke up. That's what he said, approximately 45 minutes ago. Another voice from further back. He told us the same thing at dinner 2 weeks ago. That Booker Meridian had signed off and we were in the documentation phase. A third. My firm committed capital based on that representation. Damon turned toward his investors. Gentlemen, context matters here. The deal has not been approved, I said. Not loudly. I did not need volume. Meridian Gateway has been in active compliance review for 3 weeks following a formal complaint from an outside investor who was told, by representatives of Gaines Urban Development, that my company had already issued a guarantee on the partnership. We issued no such guarantee. The deal was never offered. The approval process was ongoing. I opened the folder and found the relevant page. The compliance documentation records 14 separate instances over a 4-month period in which Gaines Urban's representatives communicated materially false information about the status of this transaction to prospective investors. I looked up at Damon. Tonight would be 15. The investors had stopped looking at me. They had started looking at Damon. This can be resolved, Damon said. His voice had changed register. Still controlled, but working harder than it had been. Terrence, you and I have never actually sat down together. If we could get in a room Monday morning, walk through the structure, there is no Monday morning. He stopped. Gaines Urban Development is removed from Meridian Gateway consideration effective tonight. I handed the folder back to David. The deal is done. The partnership is closed. The room absorbed this. I watched it move through the investors the way a current moves through water. Invisible until you see what it does to everything it touches. The man with the silver cufflinks took out his phone. The man to Damon's right turned to speak quietly to the person beside him. 2 men near the bar began moving toward the exit, and once they began moving, others followed with the specific purposefulness of people suddenly remembering prior commitments. Damon stood in the center of the room and watched his evening come apart. I had built tonight carefully. The venue, the guest list, the networking structure embedded inside a 16-year-old's birthday party. Every element had been arranged to project an image of a man on the threshold of something enormous, a man whose word was sufficient collateral, whose confidence was its own guarantee. He had needed 1 night to consolidate investor confidence ahead of a Monday closing that existed only in his own presentation materials. I had held the event in a building my company owned. He had invited me to clean the floor. The cruelest part of watching it unravel was how fast it moved. The investors who had been competing for proximity to Damon 40 minutes ago now maintained the kind of careful physical distance that communicated everything without requiring a single direct statement. Nobody accused him of anything aloud. Nobody needed to. They simply stopped facing him. They turned their shoulders by a few degrees and began conversations with people on the other side of them. And within 10 minutes, the orbit that had formed around him all evening had dissolved as though it had never existed. Rochelle appeared at my left. She had been standing back from the investor conversations, and I think the distance had allowed her to understand what was happening before Damon did. Her voice was lower than I had heard it all evening. "Terrence, please." "For what?" "You know what we put into this." She glanced toward Damon, then back to me. "I put my own money in. My savings, the Riverside property." "I know." "Then you understand what this means." I looked at her for a moment without answering. Then I looked at the floor near the entrance, the section that had been cleaned twice tonight, and where two $20 bills had floated down from Damon's hand approximately 2 hours ago. They were still there, slightly off to the side, where a staff member had moved them out of the walking path without removing them entirely. I walked to them. I picked them up. Rochelle watched me, trying to determine what the gesture meant. I walked back to her and held the 2 bills out until she took them. "Hold on to those," I said. "Tonight you're going to need a tip more than I do." She looked down at the wet bills in her hand. She did not speak. Lorraine Gaines, who had been standing near the edge of the room with the careful positioning of someone who had been monitoring every conversation simultaneously, chose this moment to step forward. She had the bearing of a woman who had spent decades using social authority as a substitute for direct power, and she deployed it now with the confidence of someone who had not yet understood that the room had changed. "You're going to destroy a family over a mop? Over a misunderstanding at a party?" I turned to face her. "Damon is losing the contract because he told investors for 4 months that a partnership existed that he had never been offered. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a documented pattern. He made some aggressive representations. I used my company's name as collateral to raise other people's money." I kept my voice level. "The mop has nothing to do with that. If you're looking for the person responsible for where this evening ended, you're standing next to him." Lorraine looked at Damon. Damon was already moving toward David Reeves, making one final attempt at a sidebar conversation that David terminated in approximately 4 seconds. Damon had reassembled himself enough to approach me directly one more time. There was no performance left in his posture, just a man running out of options in a room that had watched him run out of them. "You can't just end this here, not like this." "It ended itself." I said it without particular emphasis. "I'm just the one who witnessed it." He looked at me with the expression of someone searching for a version of events in which he had not done the things he had done. I did not find it. "This is still my family's event," he said finally, with the particular desperation of a person reaching for the one argument no one has addressed yet. "This is our home tonight." Marcus Webb had been standing near the entrance corridor the entire time, quiet, professional, absorbing the evening with the composure of a man who would later have a significant amount to document in his incident report. He spoke up. "Mr. Gaines, this is a Booker Meridian property." Damon looked at him. Marcus met the look without difficulty. Zaria had been standing to my right for the past several minutes. She had not spoken during any of the investor conversations or the exchange with Rochelle. She had simply stood there next to me, watching. I had been aware of her presence the entire time, the way you are aware of something you are protecting, not with active attention, but with the constant peripheral certainty that it is still there. She stepped forward now. She looked at Damon first, then at Lorraine. "I want them to leave." Rochelle inhaled sharply. "Zaria!" "This is my birthday." Her voice was steady. 16 years old and steadier than most adults in the room. "You laughed when Mom made Dad clean the floor. Both of you." She looked at Damon. "You dropped money at his feet." She looked at Lorraine. "You thought that was funny." Neither of them responded. "I want you both to leave right now." The 2 security personnel who had been moving toward me 40 minutes ago, who had been directed to remove me from a building my company owned, turned and repositioned themselves near Damon. Damon looked at me. I did not instruct anyone. I did not make a gesture or give a signal. This was not my moment to direct. He looked at Zaria. She did not look away. He walked toward the exit. Lorraine followed him, her composure intact in the rigid way of someone who has decided that surface dignity is the only thing left to preserve. The investors who had not already left filtered out around them, most looking at their phones, some in quiet conversation with their associates, all of them recalculating. The room did not applaud. It did not need to. I found a venue manager and gave 3 instructions. Remove every piece of Gaines Urban branded material. The banners near the bar, the printed materials on the cocktail tables, the pull-up display near the entrance that listed Damon's firm as a co-presenting sponsor of the evening. Remove all of it. Bring out whatever food had been prepared that had not been served yet. Bring out the cake. The DJ, who had been watching the entire sequence of events from behind his equipment, with the wide-eyed attentiveness of someone who would be telling this story for years, received a brief set of instructions from the venue coordinator, and then put on the first song from Zaria's actual birthday playlist, the list she had given him at the start of the evening that he had spent 2 hours overriding in favor of background music better suited to investor networking. The atmosphere in the room shifted in the way atmospheres shift when a pretense is removed. The remaining guests, Zaria's actual friends, 2 of her teachers who had come, 3 of her track teammates, a handful of relatives on Rochelle's side who had nothing to do with any of the business components of the evening, seemed to collectively exhale. Rochelle stood near the edge of the hall. She had not followed Damon out. I had not expected her to. She held the 2 $20 bills in her right hand and looked at the room that had reorganized itself around her daughter in the span of 20 minutes. The cake came out. 5 tiers, purple and gold, with 16 candles that took the staff member 3 attempts to fully light. Zaria stood in front of it. I moved to stand beside her. Rochelle came to stand on her other side. She was quiet. I do not know what she was thinking. I did not ask. Zaria looked at the candles for a moment. Then she looked up at me. Dad. Yeah. Do you actually own this place? A company of mine owns it. And you're actually a billionaire? Yes. She looked out through the window at the parking area, where my SUV sat between a Bentley and a Range Rover. And you drove that. It works fine. She started laughing. Not the polite, managed laugh of someone performing amusement. Actually, laughing. The way she used to laugh when she was 8 years old and found something genuinely surprising and funny. 2 of her friends standing nearby caught it and started laughing with her, though they were not entirely sure why yet. She hugged me. Hard. The way she had not since she was small. Then she turned back to the candles and blew them all out in one breath. The room cheered. 3 days later, I pulled into Rochelle's driveway at 11 in the morning to pick up Zaria for the weekend. The SUV made the slight grinding noise it had been making for 6 months that I kept telling myself I would have looked at. Rochelle was standing on the front step. She was not dressed for anything particular. No occasion, no performance. She was just standing there in the way of someone who has decided to be somewhere before they have decided what to do once they arrive. I put the car in park. She came down the 2 steps and stopped at the edge of the walkway. I didn't know, she said. I genuinely didn't know you'd become what you became. I thought about how to answer that honestly. No, I said, that part's true. She looked at me. But that's not what you got wrong. She waited. You knew who I was, Rochelle. You knew what I was willing to work for and what I was willing to give up and how I treated people when I didn't need anything from them. You knew all of that. 12 years of marriage, you knew me. I let her hold that for a moment. What you didn't know was the number in the account. And somewhere along the way, you decided the number was the thing that mattered. That the number was what told you whether the rest of it was worth your time. She did not answer. That's what you got wrong, not the money, the order of operations. The front door opened behind her and Zaria came out with a weekend bag over one shoulder and her track spikes looped around the other, which meant she had a practice schedule I had not been told about yet. She came down the steps, kissed at her mother on the cheek, and threw her bag in the back seat. Let's go, Dad. I need to be at the track by 1. I looked at Rochelle one last time. She was still holding something. Not the conversation, but something older than that. Something she had been carrying since before the party, before Damon, before the years of watching me drive up in a vehicle she was embarrassed by. Take care of yourself, I said. I got in the car. Zaria was already adjusting the radio. She landed on a song she liked and turned it up without asking, the way she had done since she was 12 and decided she was old enough to control the aux cord. I backed out of the driveway. Rochelle was still standing on the walkway when I turned onto the street. I watched her in the rearview mirror until I could not see her anymore. A woman standing in front of a house she had taken as evidence of something, finally understanding what she had actually lost and what she had never understood she had. She had not lost the opportunity to be married to a billionaire. She had chosen to leave a man who was going to build something, and then spent 12 years constructing a story about why that man had failed, because the alternative required her to sit with a question she was not ready to answer. The question was not whether she had made the wrong choice. People make choices with the information they have. The question that had no comfortable answer was this: what had she actually been measuring all those years? Not love, not the quality of the person beside her. She had been measuring output. Visible, legible, publicly confirmable output. A house that announced her. A car that announced her. A husband whose accomplishments could be described in a sentence at a dinner party. She had not built her life around a person. She had built it around a signal. And signals, it turned out, could be manufactured by men like Damon without much difficulty at all. I had stopped needing her to arrive at any of this a long time ago. Zarya turned the radio up one more notch. I drove. The most dangerous thing you can do is judge someone's ceiling by what they look like on the quietest day of their life. Terrence did not become worth respecting the moment that room learned who he was. He was worth respecting when he's picked up that mop and chose his daughter over his pride, when no one in that building had any reason to give him credit for it. The money only revealed what was already true about every single person standing there. If that kind of story stays with you, subscribe to the channel. Every week there is a new one, and every one of them is built around the same idea. The people who are the hardest to see clearly are almost always the ones most worth paying attention to.